Listeners, you are in for a treat because we have the very accomplished Barbara Hinske from Phoenix, Arizona on our show today. Accomplished starting with her previous job practicing law to becoming a full-time novelist, a podcast co-host, and as of this fall, with 2 of her books being made into Hallmark movies. She says she inherited the fiction gene from her father, who wrote mysteries when he retired and told her a story every night of her childhood. Barbara, so glad to have you on Murder in the Air.
Laurie, thank you so much for having me. I love this podcast and the name of the podcast particularly, and its host, so I'm so glad to be here.
Thank you. Thanks for taking the time, too. So, we'll talk about Cameron Matheson in a little bit, who was in your first Hallmark movie. But first, you have several series. The Rosemont, you have Paws and Pastries, you have Who's There, and Emily. Now, in the Rosemont series, your protagonist is a forensic accountant who later becomes mayor. Hope that's not a spoiler alert. Then your Emily series is a lovely set of stories about a newly visually impaired woman who has to deal with an entirely different world. And you say it was conceived during a tour of the Foundation for Blind Children. Tell us about that experience.
You know, I live down the street from the foundation. It's quite a prominent organization here in the state of Arizona. And I had never been through it for a tour. So my husband and I were seated next to the development director for the foundation in 2018 at a Black Tie fundraiser for Desert Foothills Library. And I know you have a lot of connection with Desert Foothills. I had donated a live auction item of the name of a character in one of my books. And the woman who bought that was Emily Main, who became the lead character in Guiding Emily.
I see.
Anyway,
how fun.
So Steve and his wife were chatting with us, and we were having a delightful time. He said, well, for heaven's sakes, come to the foundation next week and take a tour. So we did. And about halfway through, Brian and I were both literally choking back tears, looking at the work that the foundation does. The name says Foundation for Children, but their oldest child is 104 years old. So they serve a large adult community as well, doing remarkable things. One experience that some people don't necessarily believe in all this, and that's fine. Everybody, you do you believe. I believe this was a God experience in my life. I was standing there. A 4-year-old child comes up to me, throws his arms around me, and he's giggling. And so my body is vibrating with his little laughing. And Steve said, yes, he was born blind and with a number of other co-disabilities in Canada. His parents had been told that he wouldn't live very long, that he'd never walk, never talk. And the best they could do would be to make him comfortable. Well, as you can imagine, those heartbroken parents didn't accept that and emigrated to the United States. I mean, think about what that entails.
Right.
And put his child at the foundation. And there he was, very much walking and talking and loving life. So I'm just out of my mind at this point, thinking, what can I do to help them? We run by the Braille Library. The foundation has a great big Braille operation. And there's a check on the wall, one of those presentation checks from Major League Baseball for $1 million. And I thought, well, I'm going to check on that wall for me, except I'm not rich. So how can I do that? Well, a book can raise money.
That's right.
And I donate half of my proceeds, royalties from Guiding Emily, to the foundation for blind children. Just a little extra about that. I asked Steve, so what do you need besides money? You're a nonprofit, you always need money. And he said, we need to make the sighted community aware of how isolated blind people feel in the greater community. And I thought, well, I can do that.
Absolutely.
I can write about that in my book.
Right.
So that started this whole mission. By the time, within an hour, I went in there thinking my next writing project would be another Guiding Emily. And when I came out, I thought, no, I'm going to write this book about Emily Main, who loses her eyesight And I met guide dogs when I was there because a lot of the staff are blind and use guide dogs.
I see.
And I met a guide dog named Gnocchi, Black Lab. And I thought, well, I'm going to lighten up this heavy story of a woman losing her eyesight and going into despair and depression. I'm going to lighten it up with the story of a guide dog puppy who then becomes a guide dog. And at the end, that'll lighten the story, which it does, because I have him as a point of view character. At the end of the book, the two, Emily and Garth, come together. And so the book is really an unusual love story because it's their love story of how they come together. Long-winded answer, but
no, it's a lovely, lovely story.
It's been a remarkable journey with this book.
Now, let's talk movies. You were on the set this summer during the filming of the screen adaptation of Guiding Emily, which just aired on the Hallmark Channel in September. How was that experience for you?
The experience was absolutely remarkable and wonderful. It's something I will never forget. It was filmed in Victoria, British Columbia, which is absolutely beautiful. There's, nobody should have a bad time there.
Right.
But when I went to the set, I was a little nervous. Sets are more closed down now than the last time that I was at a movie set. I kind of thought we were only going to get to go for one day, and I had made reservations for 2 weeks in Victoria. But I thought, well, let's just see what happens. And fortunately, they invited us back every single day. In fact, we got there late one day, and they were worried that something happened to us. So it was a very welcoming experience. And this script followed very closely the book and really honored the emotional journey of a woman who loses her eyesight and loses her relationship as a result. As often happens when somebody loses their sight, a marriage or a relationship breaks up, that happens to her. So all of that was accurately and honorably portrayed. And I wanted that to be the case. I didn't want this to be all the hard edges smoothed out, because that isn't the experience. Right. But it's very hopeful because she does regain her independence and her life.
Talk about the actress. Did they use somebody who was visually impaired, or was she a sighted actress?
She was a sighted actress. Her name is Sarah Drew. She is a remarkable, remarkable actress, and she said it was such a moving role. We could tell that she worked extensively. We did have, I think, every other character that was blind, including all of the background extras, were played by blind actors. And she spent a lot of time working with the blind actors to get it right. And I'm telling you what, get it right, she did. Really? I hope, there's a scene in the movie where she's at her doctor's office. She's had surgery, hopefully to restore her sight. Bandages come off and her sight is not restored. And she realizes in that moment that she will be blind for the rest of her life. I mean, you can just imagine. They filmed that scene at the end of the day on a Friday because it was going to be so heavy. About half an hour as they were setting up the scene, the first assistant director was going around telling everyone, quiet, be quiet. Just brought the whole temperature down on the set.
Sure.
And every single solitary person on that set was crying during that scene. Wow. Not just Emily, but through each take, it was more and more intense. One of the producers finally took off his headset and said, I can't listen to it anymore. Wow. There was, tissues, Kleenexes flying everywhere. When I say every single solitary person, there are 75, as you well know, there are at least 75 people working on a movie set.
Wow. Right. Right. And all different.
Yeah. All different positions and lighting, all the stuff. Wow. So I'll never forget that. I will never, ever forget her and that scene.
My goodness. Now, I know that you had a cameo in your first book that was made into a Hallmark movie called The Christmas Club.
Yeah.
And it also played again this past summer for a Christmas in July special.
Yeah.
But they named the hospital after you in Guiding Emily?
Yes, that was so fun. They named it Hinske Memorial and, had the signs. In fact, they gave me a sign to take home that I could mail home from Canada. And,
Fun.
All the big TV screens said Hinske Memorial. And it was so fun. We walked on set and nobody told us in advance. So we're just sitting there watching it. And then finally somebody elbows me. One of the producers elbows me and points. And I'm like, so that was such a thrill. It was just, yeah.
Sure.
Those people on movie sets can be so kind and delightful. I found everyone to a person nice and welcoming and just lovely. That's right. On set, we had 8 different puppies who played Garth at different ages.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so you can't miss when you've got Golden Lab.
Yeah, that's right.
Underfoot. I mean, my goodness, that was fabulous. And all of those dogs were at some point in the process of becoming guide dogs. They were all in guide dog training.
They were.
Yeah, so that was kind of fun.
Great. That's good. Good. And that was probably good training for them to be around those kind of people.
Oh, probably. Yeah.
Absolutely right.
Yeah.
So you did get a cameo in the first one.
Yes.
So tell us about that role in the bakery shop, right?
Well, our first day on set was at this beautiful, charming bakery in Winnipeg. And we walk in and I'm all nervous and, how are we going to be received? And people couldn't have been nicer. And pretty soon the director, the third assistant director who is responsible for the background people comes up to me and says, you want to be in the movie? And I'm like, well, yeah, I'd like to. So off to hair and makeup I go. It was a heat wave in Winnipeg and they never turn the AC on inside a building when they're filming because it's too noisy. So it was in the 90s and I go from my nice little Arizona t-shirt to 2 sweaters and a scarf. Finally, we lost the scarf. It was too high. But nonetheless, I was sitting at a table with Gabrielle Rose, who plays one of the characters in, one of the main characters in The Christmas Club, eating cheesecake. So I have no acting credentials, but I can certainly eat cheesecake with the best of them. So I spent 2 hours eating cheesecake.
2 hours.
And I got paid to do it, as I like to say.
Yay.
So there's nothing to complain about with that. It was fun to see myself. I was a little disappointed that we weren't extras in this movie, but it's a different kind of movie. These are different times, and having it's even better having it be Hinske Memorial.
Absolutely. Now that the one that you had the cameo was the Christmas Club, which again has been a very popular one for Hallmark.
Yeah.
Cameron Matheson, one of my favorite actors starting way back in his soap opera days, is the star, and he's done a lot of Hallmark movies. So what was he really like? He's better looking in person, which almost seems impossible, right? Right.
He's one good looking guy. But you know what? He is nicer and kinder than you could imagine. He portrays himself as this very nice guy. Even more so. I was so impressed with him. He sat and talked with me for quite a while. At one point, because it was so hot, they had like Suburbans that would sit at the curb. The actors could go in and he had his own. But he told us, he said, when you want to cool off, just sit in my car. It's fine. That was kind of him. But also, there were scenes where he was around a lot. There were little kids in the scenes. And it was hot. They were getting a little rowdy, a little hard to control. And he would sit with these kids and they would play games and he would ask them questions. And he's a father himself. I'm sure he's a very good father, but he would engage these children. And, he didn't have to do that. What I found out later was that shortly after this finished filming, he had his surgery where he had his kidney removed. He had kidney cancer. So while he was on set during a heat wave, wearing winter coats, doing extra things, and he was very ill. It's just remarkable to think of that.
Absolutely.
And, the minimum contracted day at that point, I believe, was 14 hours. So people think, it's so glamorous, while the actual doing of it is like 8 hours on the rock pile. It is really hard work.
Tedious sometimes.
Tedious, yeah.
Sit around and wait a lot of times.
Yeah.
Right. And how was it that your books got made into both of these movies? Can you talk a little bit about that process?
Anybody who's an author will be interested in that. So the first book, The Christmas Club, many reviewers said, boy, this would make a great Hallmark movie. So I thought, okay, well, I don't know how to make that happen. So I live in Phoenix, Arizona, nowhere near Burbank where Hallmark Channel is, or Kansas City where big Hallmark is. But I would ask every single solitary person I ran into that I knew, do you know anybody at Hallmark? And, in Costco, in the grocery, and people mostly would look at me like I was crazy. But, one woman said, well, my neighbor at the cabin is John Esquinas, who produces Good Witch, which is their most successful franchise. Do you want me to give him the book? I couldn't get out to my car and back in Costco with a book for her to give him fast enough.
Fast enough, yeah.
And she did. And 3 weeks later, I was in negotiations with John.
Oh, my
unbelievable.
Goodness. That's unusual too, but that's a great story.
But I hope it's a story of hope for other authors, because it is possible. You don't need, in neither case did I have an agent or someone who paved the way for me. So with Guiding Emily, of course, when I was writing it, I still kept my relationship with John and the other producers and the other and the director, and I was trying to pitch them Guiding Emily, but they said, "Oh, Hallmark will never go for it. They don't like movies with dogs." Which now that I've worked on a set with dogs, I can see why they are so hard to do anything with. True. But at any rate, they make everything more time consuming. But at any rate, I didn't get anywhere with that. But I did a Kirkus review. I paid for a Kirkus review for Guiding Emily. And, at the time, I think I got it on sale for $375, but that's still a lot of money. Everybody thinks about, am I going to spend that money on it? But I thought, oh, what the heck? Right. Just spend the money. And Beth Grossbart, who is our executive producer, reads Kirkus reviews looking for her next project. And that's how she found me.
I'll be darned.
So take authors out there, take heart. There are many ways into this, many ways. Right.
Interesting. Oh, that is really, that is hopeful. That is good to hear. Let's talk about some other writing processes. What is your writing process like? When is your best time to write?
Yeah. So now that I'm full-time pursuing my author career as a full-time, I've kind of changed things up a little bit. I try and write two blocks of no more than 2 hours each block, separated usually by lunch and maybe some fooling around a little bit, probably a 2-hour break. So I try and write 5 days a week, 5 consecutive days, 4 to 5 hours a day with a break. And I try to get 2,000 to 2,500 words each day. So at the end of my week, I have 10,000 to roughly 12,000 words. I send those off to my long-term editor, who I now work with as I'm writing, and she'll go through them. We'll talk about what's working, what's not, who's been off the page too long, what's too repetitive. She almost always tells me I need to put in more description. I don't like to do that, and it's my short suit. I make the changes and then I start in again. So it takes me about 6 to 7 weeks to write a full novel, 3 weeks, I'll do 4 weeks for a novella. And we've developed this very efficient process as a result. After I get that first draft done, then I'll do a read aloud edit to myself, mark the edits, and then it's generally ready for line editing and proofreading, which I have somebody else do.
Okay.
So at this stage in my career, I've got a real process, and it's pretty efficient.
Right.
Works.
And so at the end of your week, you talk to her right then. You don't take a week off while she's looking at it. You
No.
talk to her right then, make the changes then.
Yeah.
Right as while it's still fresh.
As I do it, yeah. I'll send it to her on Sunday nights. Then Monday and Tuesday are my day off because I talk to her on Tuesday, midday usually, and then I take the rest of the day off and back at it on Wednesday. Wednesday through Sunday, I'm pounding away.
Wow. That's great.
And that's been a really good process for me. I start out with, I'm not a pantser. I'm not a full-on plotter. My podcast co-host has a spreadsheet with details on each scene and the tabs and no.
Not you. Okay.
That's too much. But I do kind of know where I'm going. I certainly know what my character arc is, and I know what the big chunks of scenes I want to write are.
Sure. And to have that person to bounce things off of, get her feedback right away, I think is a great system. And how did you stumble into that kind of a system? Because that's, I don't think, a normal one for a lot of people. I don't
think it is for a lot of people. I was referred to her as a developmental editor in 2011 for my first book, which published in 2012. And she gave me a developmental edit that said, you're missing an entire plot arc here. I thought, ooh. So I worked with her as a developmental editor at that point. And I think I did the same thing with with the sequel. But then after that, I'm like, wait a minute, why don't we just work with this more as a writing coach kind of thing?
Right.
At the end of the day, I think working with a writing coach is cheaper than completing a manuscript and sending it off for developmental editing and then reworking it based upon the feedback that you're always going to get. I don't know anybody who's done a developmental edit and received a manuscript where they've said, gosh, it's all just perfection.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So
true.
Correcting
and it sounds like
go.
your time frame is also faster, it sounds like.
Yeah, I think I'm pretty fast. I mean, I'm not one of these book a month rapid release gals. And I'm not going to be, and I have no interest in being that.
Yeah.
But I can still turn out a novel in a decent amount of time.
Sure. Wow. So what is the most surprising thing that you've discovered about writing?
Well, maybe about writing or about maybe the writing life. I think the writing life, the most surprising and just happy thing is how nice it is to hear from readers, from people who tell you your book has given me comfort or hope or just been uplifting or it's made a hard day better.
Right.
Gosh, I had no idea. I know a lot of what I write is just little old women's fiction. But you know what? I've learned not to downplay the good that you can do in the world by...
You've made an impact, even if it's one person. And obviously, it's a lot more than one person.
But even making one person's day better, well, okay. Right. I think that's pretty special.
Nice is that? Absolutely. So what are you working on next?
So currently, I am writing a novella that's going to be part of a connected series in 2025. It's the Dragonfly Dog Park series. And we're not, really publicizing it yet, but there are, I think, 8 of us authors that are writing together. We like each other a lot, which is helpful because it is a lot of work to write a connected series. I just finished reworking.
Oh, you mean all 8 of you working on the same story?
Well, different stories, but we've got to have a shared experience in the beginning and end.
Okay.
And then our characters have to flow in and out of each other. And the world that's created, the bakery is the bakery. It's got to be the same bakery for everybody. And
fun.
It's fun, but it's a whole lot harder than you might think. So I spent yesterday reworking. I'm one of the first ones to write their novel. I thought, good, I'll get mine done, then everybody can work around me. Well, It's not quite working out that way.
Oh.
because someone else has started her book and started it very differently than mine. And I thought, okay, I'm going to go ahead and modify my beginning because I think hers is better and I think it is more accurate.
Interesting.
I liked hers much better than mine. So I thought, okay, sister, suck it up and rewrite it. So I did.
Good. Oh, fun. So do you have a title for it yet?
I don't think we're allowed to announce them yet.
Okay, that's fine. We'll keep people posted.
But that's what I'm working on. It'll be
good. Okay, so why don't you give us a bit of a setup for the selection you're going to read today, and then read your segment from Chapter 1 of Final Circuit.
I'm reading the first chapter from my novel in the Who's There collection. Title is Final Circuit. The opening scene is based upon, opening scene is set in a parking garage. And it really is the novelization of not an experience I really had in a parking garage, but what I always scared myself thinking would happen when I had a job as a law clerk when I was in law school, and I would have to file things at the courthouse at the end of the day. And in the Midwest, in the winter, by the time I would come out at 4:45, it was dark. I didn't have money to pay for parking, so the top floor was free. And I would go up there and it would be deserted. And I would always say, gosh, what if a serial killer was up here? I'd be in all kinds of trouble. So that's what I wrote about. All right. Chapter 1. Olivia Osgood turned up the collar of her heavy woolen coat against the icy wind that skimmed the concrete block wall of the parking garage. She glanced around her. She was truly isolated. She should have paid to park in the underground garage down the block instead of this shabby municipal parking structure that rose 6 stories, like a blemish on the face of downtown. Her grandmother had raised her to be thrifty, and Olivia's penny-pitching ways were firmly set now that she was in her late 20s. If she'd thought about the fact that she'd be returning to the garage after the end of normal business hours alone, she'd have spent the money on the other garage. She pushed the button to summon the elevator. The last rays of afternoon sunshine failed to penetrate the elevator lobby of the garage. The sole fluorescent bulb flickered, scattering shadows into the corners. The elevator arrived and she hurried in, pushing the button for the top floor. The heavy metal doors crept together. Olivia steadied herself for the chug of the car as the motor engaged, but the elevator sat motionless. She stabbed at the button for her floor. The elevator didn't move. A frisson of fear ran up her spine. How long will I be trapped before help arrives? She rubbed her hands together. It wasn't much warmer in the elevator than it had been in the garage. She located a red button on the control panel and bent over to read the words that had been worn off by frequent use. Call help. She pushed the button, but no alarm sounded, and the dented speaker grill next to the button remained silent. Will I be here until people arrive for work in the morning? She racked her brain. How cold was it predicted to be that night? Will I freeze to death while I wait? Olivia shook her head to clear her thoughts. Stop letting your imagination run away with you. She leaned into the button for her floor, then jabbed it 3 times in succession. The motor shuddered, and the elevator began its sluggish ascent. Olivia moaned softly and fished a crumpled tissue out of her coat pocket to dab at the tears that came so easily since her grandmother's death. The elevator lurched to a stop at her floor. She stepped out and the doors closed behind her. She shielded her eyes from the glare of the setting sun with one hand and hoisted her purse onto her shoulder with the other. A movement at the far end of the garage caught her attention. She froze and stared in disbelief. Silhouetted against the crimson sky along the outside row of parking spaces, a tall figure in a black jacket leaned over the open trunk of a dark sedan, his face obscured by a ski mask. He struggled under the weight of the large object he carried. Olivia blinked hard against the blinding light and focused. He was carrying a woman wearing a black skirt and low heels. A scarf draped across the woman's body provided a slash of crimson against her inky clothing and white hair. Her head dangled at a precarious angle. The woman was dead. Olivia heard herself scream. The sound reverberated in the concrete structure. Bile rose in her throat. The figure lifted his masked face to hers. He stood no more than 200 feet from her. Olivia stumbled backwards until the closed elevator doors stopped her escape. No! She pressed against the unyielding metal surface. I've got to get out of here. She jerked herself around and fumbled for the button to summon the elevator. She punched at it frantically and watched the readout over the door as the elevator worked its way back to her, floor by floor. Come on, for God's sake, come on. She whipped her head over her shoulder and forced herself to look at the man as he threw the body into the trunk and slammed the lid. The victim's head and one foot caught on the opening of the trunk, and the lid sprang back up after hitting them with a sickening thud. He abandoned the body and began to run toward Olivia. She tried to scream for help, but this time no sound emerged. The elevator was still 2 floors away. It's not going to make it in time. She swung to her right and saw the door next to the elevator marked stairs. She lunged at the handle and tugged, but the door wouldn't open. Shit. The man was coming fast. Olivia thrust herself back to the elevator as the doors began to part. She flung herself into the elevator and searched for the closed door button. Focus, she screamed internally as she looked at the symbols for open door and closed door. Which is the right one? The arrows pointing toward each other? That had to be it. Her hand shook as she reached out to push the button. She couldn't make a mistake. If she hit the wrong one, he would capture her and kill her. I have to do this. Olivia took a deep breath to steady herself. She pushed the button and the elevator doors started to close. She looked up to stare in horror at the man running toward her. He'd cover half of the distance between them and was picking up speed as the elevator doors made their steady progress toward each other. Her heart hammered in her chest and she flattened herself against the back of the elevator. The man dove toward her as the doors shut. He grunted as his torso hit the ground outside the elevator. He thrust one gloved hand into the opening and curled his fingers around the edge of the door. The doors stopped moving toward each other. Oh my God, he's going to open the door. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. If she didn't do something now, she would be his. She bounded toward the door, her eyes fastened on its hand as he tried to force the doors open. She brought the heel of her right foot up and lashed out at him, kicking viciously at his fingertips. Her heel connected firmly with his gloved hand, but he held on. She brought her foot back and struck again. She hit her mark and lost her balance, sprawling on the floor of the elevator. She tilted her head back and stared into the dark eyes behind the killer's mask. Olivia recoiled at the malice that glittered there. He lost his grip, and his wrist hit the metal threshold of the elevator. She tore her eyes from his and crawled to the control panel, leaning into the closed door button. His hand slid out of sight, and the doors closed. The elevator shook as the masked man pounded on the closed door. Olivia propelled herself crab-like into the far corner of the elevator and drew into a ball, hugging herself. She held her breath, expecting the doors to reopen, but the motor engaged. The elevator began its descent. Olivia bent forward as another wave of nausea washed over her. For one frightening moment, she thought she might pass out. She swallowed hard. Don't give in. Keep your wits about you. She wasn't safe yet. He could be waiting when she got out of the elevator. She needed to call the police. Olivia tried to pull herself into a standing position, but her legs were too shaky to support her. She crawled to her purse and retrieved her cell phone. She sat cross-legged on the filthy floor and brought phone's screen into view. A guttural moan escaped her lips. She had no cell service in the elevator. She flung the phone back into her purse. Now what? The elevator bounced to a stop on the first floor and the doors began to part. Olivia forced herself to her feet, placing one hand on the opening to steady herself. She reached for the closed door button with her other hand. What if he's out there waiting for me? She leaned out of the elevator and quickly looked right and left, sweeping her eyes over the shadowy scene in front of her. Everything was still. She could see most of the first floor of the garage from her vantage point. The only vehicles remaining were an SUV and a minivan. There were no dark sedans in sight. The first floor of the garage was deserted, and the masked man was nowhere to be seen. Olivia gulped in a deep breath. She couldn't stay where she was. She had to get out of there and call for help. She propelled herself from the elevator, swiveling her head wildly, searching for the killer as she ran. She stumbled, almost sprawling on the ground, but managed to keep her feet under her. She rounded the corner and ran out of the garage, darting across the street mid-block. A van screeched to a halt, narrowly avoiding her, and the driver laid on his horn. Olivia ignored him and raced to the double-glass doors of the office building where she had been meeting with the lawyer for her grandmother's estate less than 15 minutes earlier. She'd be safe with him. Howard Asher would call the police. He'd know what to do. Olivia tugged at the heavy doors of the building. They didn't yield. She checked her watch. It was almost 6:30. The doors were locked. People had been streaming out of the building when she'd arrived at 5:30 for her appointment with Mr. Asher. She thought he'd been kind to agree to wait for her when she telephoned to say that she'd be an hour late. Now she was sorry that she hadn't insisted she reschedule. She had been ready to leave work for her appointment when she'd taken the call from the father of the teen that had died in a tragic car accident over the weekend. She'd spent over an hour with him discussing the details of the funeral that would be held at Hilton Mortuary the next morning. What the grieving man had really needed was the sympathetic ear of a compassionate listener. Olivia hadn't had the heart to hurry him off the phone so she could attend to her own business. Now, here she was, standing on a deserted sidewalk with a killer on the loose, looking for her. She wouldn't find a safe haven at Asher Law, PLC. I've got to call the police. She turned to the street, searching for any sign of the masked man. A streetlight further down the block was out, leaving the entrance to the next building in deep shadow. She narrowed her eyes, straining to detect any movement in the darkness. Her hands shook as she tried to punch 911 into her phone.
Wow, now that was a great first chapter. That was chapter 1 from Barbara Hinske's Final Circuit, which is now available wherever you purchase your books. Thank you so much for being with us today, Barbara. Really enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you so much for having me, Laurie. The time flies when I'm with you, and I'm looking forward to reading all of your upcoming works as well.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And you can find out more about Barbara and her books on her website at barbarahinske.com, and that's Hinske. She also hosts a podcast for writers with J.W. Judge called The Right Approach, and that's WRITE. And that is also everywhere you listen to podcasts or at their website, rightapproachpod.com. You can follow her on Facebook at B. Hinske, and on Instagram, she's Barbara Hinske, author, as well as she's on TikTok as Barbara Hinske. All the details will be in the show notes. Our author extra today is Kathy McIntosh from Tucson, Arizona, and in her world, quote, words, intrigue, and laughter rule. After a career in high tech, she quit to write full-time, and in addition to writing murder mysteries long and short, is active with Arizona Mystery Writers and Sisters in Crime. Her story, Wrong Way Down, is part of the Desert Sleuths anthology, So West, Wrong Turn, released in September. Her books include her latest, Murder Cottonwood Style, the second in Kathy's Adventure Calls mystery series. It features different members of an eco-touring team, including tour guide and chef Madrone Hunter, who's just looking to relax in Cottonwood, but who finds the dead body of a client, and she's the chief suspect. Kathy McIntosh enjoys critters of all kinds, from the inside pet type to the outside don't pet type, and has loved words since her father quoted limericks and her mother shouted, "Not in front of the girls." Check out Kathy McIntosh at kathymcintosh.com. Join us again on episode number 24 when you'll hear the final episodes from Art of the Steal, the audiobook podcast section of my crime fiction novel, Bleeder. And in episode 25, we'll talk with author Susan McNabb, who also writes as Suki McMinn and who was Elvira's stand-in. If you're listening on the podcast platform of your choice, please subscribe and leave a review or provide us with feedback. If you're on YouTube at Read Laurie Fagen, please subscribe, give us a thumbs up, and click on the bell to be notified when a new episode has been released. And for some freebies, check out our Patreon page at Murder in the Air Mystery Theater. For more information, you can visit readlauriefagen.com. Thanks so much for listening, and come back again, where you'll always find murder in the air.